Okay, so um, I want you to imagine for a second that you are the floor manager of this massive multi-billion-dollar manufacturing plant.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, and it's this marvel of engineering, highly complex, running continuously to produce basically everything your society needs to survive.
Like a vital infrastructure hub.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Instead of actually reading the operational manual to understand how the machines work, like
Mhm.
how to do maintenance or set the dials your employees they just stand in front of the conveyor belts at specific hours of the day.
Wait, what are they doing?
They're chanting the manual out loud.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're just reciting it to the machines, hoping the factory runs itself.
You'd fire them. I mean, you would think they were completely detached from reality.
You would,
And
because it's completely irrational. Yet, if we look at the analytical reframing of the scholar Parwes, which is the foundational source for our deep dive today, that is exactly what humanity has been doing with one of our most important civilizational texts for, well, the last 1,400 years.
Right, the transition from operational manual to incantation.
Exactly. We took a literal operational manual for reality and turned it into magic spells.
And it's a profound category error. When you approach a text as a collection of magical spells or liturgical rituals, you completely disable your ability to extract any systemic data from it.
You're just totally blind to it.
Completely. And the material we are examining today, specifically Surah Ar-Rum verses 17 through 24, has suffered this exact fate. I mean, for centuries, it has been wrapped up in this dense layer of religious sentimentality.
Yeah, lots of theological baggage.
Tons of it. But when we strip away that historical baggage and we apply a strict, rational, systems engineering lens to it, the text totally transforms.
It stops being theology.
Yes. It becomes this masterclass in sociology, evolutionary biology, and basically civilizational survival.
And I think that has to be the baseline constraint for our entire conversation today. For everyone listening, we are looking at these verses purely as an open book exam of the universe.
I like that framing.
Yeah, because the natural order is not merely this, pretty background for human rituals. The natural order is the argument itself. The text argues that the universe is a running system with observable mechanics, right? And human survival depends entirely on aligning with those mechanics.
Absolutely. So let's look at the very first instruction in this sequence, verses 17 and 18.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So they begin, so exalt God when you reach the evening and when you rise in the morning.
Right.
Now, tradition has universally interpreted this as a mandate for a liturgical timetable.
Like specific prayer times.
Exactly. It gets localized into a physical posture and a verbal recitation at specific hours. Basically a classic clock-punching exercise.
Okay, but hold on, though. I want to push back on this immediately.
Go ahead.
Because framing morning and evening prayers as just like aligning with the planetary rotation. I mean, that sounds suspiciously like modern corporate jargon retrofitted onto ancient poetry.
It does sound a bit modern, yeah.
Right, so are we sure Parwes isn't just projecting 20th century systems engineering onto a 7th century text? I mean, how do we justify jumping from exaltation to systemic alignment?
It's a great question. And we justify it through the linguistic root of the Arabic word used in the text, which is tasbih.
Tasbih.
Okay.
Yeah.
Traditionally, it's translated as glorification, but the actual root mechanics of the word denote movement, specifically moving swiftly in water or operating smoothly in an assigned orbit.
Oh, like an orbit, so celestial mechanics.
Exactly. Think of a celestial body maintaining its trajectory without friction. So in a systems context, tasbih is not about standing in place and offering verbal praise to the sky.
Right.
It is the physical and structural act of operating in perfect, frictionless harmony with the productive order of a system.
So to go back to my factory floor analogy from earlier,
Yeah, let's go back to that.
I don't praise the machinery by reciting its schematics to the ceiling, right? I perform tasbih of the factory by aligning my workforce shifts, my energy consumption, and my production outputs with the power grid's peak and off-peak hours.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You harmonize your behavior with the physical constraints of the architecture.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the text explicitly mentions the phases of the day, right?
Yeah.
The evening, the morning, the night, the noon.
Yeah.
That isn't a liturgical timetable imposed upon humans from some unseen, mystical realm. That is the natural cycle of the Earth itself. It's the physical reality of planetary rotation.
So the schedule is the planet.
The schedule is the planet. The text is demanding that your socio-economic activities, the way your civilization produces, consumes, structures its time, all of it must be fundamentally integrated with those rotational phases.
Wow. Okay, so if we accept that premise, it completely indicts modern society.
100%.
I mean, think about how we operate today. We run this 24/7 hyper-capitalist grind. We artificially light up the night, effectively abolishing darkness in our urban centers.
Right. Light pollution everywhere.
Yeah, and we destroy the biological circadian rhythms of our workforce just to squeeze out, like, marginal productivity at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
We are entirely out of alignment with the system's baseline schedule.
We are grinding our gears against the machinery of the planet. And the systemic feedback for that misalignment is severe biological and sociological breakdown.
Like what?
Well, increased disease, massive cognitive decline, societal burnout. A civilization that ignores the physical constraints of its environment in favor of artificial nonstop extraction is basically failing the TASB protocol.
Because the natural cycle is the primary data point.
Exactly. You cannot build a sustainable society that is actively at war with the rotation of its own host planet. It just doesn't work.
Okay, so a civilization must align its socio-economic engine with the physical mechanics of the Earth. But, to even desire that kind of systemic alignment, to recognize that we are part of this grand rotating machine and not just desperate creatures scrambling for our next meal, humans need an upgrade.
A cognitive upgrade.
Right. Because if you are operating purely on basic survival instincts, you don't care about planetary rotation.
No, you only care about caloric intake.
Exactly. Which brings us to the second part of this analysis. The foundational distinction Parwes draws between the utilitarian level of existence and the aesthetic level of existence.
This is such a crucial distinction. The utilitarian level is essentially the animal baseline. It is pure, brutal survival.
Just getting by.
Yeah. But the aesthetic level is the distinctly human upgrade.
And this is where the source's analogy of the potter and the donkey becomes incredibly useful.
I love this analogy. Walk us through it.
Okay, so imagine a potter and his donkey working side by side all day long. They travel the exact same physical distance, they bear the same scorching sun, they endure the same physical burdens.
Right, the exact same utility input.
Right. But at the end of the day, what is the donkey thinking about? The donkey's existential horizon is limited entirely to its stomach. It only sees the world in terms of utility. To the donkey, the grass is just fodder.
It's just fuel. The donkey cannot perceive the dew on that grass. It can't appreciate the way the evening light hits the blades. It lacks what the framework calls socio-economic.
Socio-economic, the aesthetic sense.
Yes, the aesthetic sense. And we have to be very careful here to strip away our modern romantic sentimentality about beauty.
Yeah, because we usually think of aesthetics as, like, interior decorating.
Exactly, or going to an art museum as a luxury. But in this systems engineering framework, beauty isn't a luxury item. The capacity to perceive aesthetics is framed as a distinct biological and psychological evolutionary milestone.
Okay, but from a pure survival standpoint, isn't aesthetic appreciation kind of a massive waste of energy?
How do you mean?
Well, if the system's only goal is survival, why engineer a creature that stops to look at a sunset when it really should be foraging for berries?
Well, that's only true if your definition of survival is measured in days rather than the millennia.
Okay, expand on that.
If the goal is the long-term, multi-generational advancement of a highly complex species, pure utility becomes a trap. Let's look at the pharmacology of a rose.
A rose, okay.
Yeah, a rose has medicinal properties, right? It has objective utility value.
Right.
If the system designer or the creator, in the text's terminology, valued only brutal utility, the medicinal properties of the rose could have been isolated entirely to the roots or the thorns.
It could have just been an ugly subterranean tuber that we dig up and chew on.
Exactly. The visual appearance of the medicine is entirely irrelevant to its chemical efficacy.
That's true.
But the system didn't do that. It engineered an incredibly complex, fragile, brightly colored, highly fragrant interface. The flower.
The interface, I like that.
The utility is deliberately wrapped in an aesthetic presentation. And this proves that the system itself operates on an aesthetic layer. Therefore, a consciousness that can perceive and appreciate that aesthetic layer.
A consciousness that recognizes the beauty, not just the calories.
Exactly. That is a higher order consciousness. It is interacting with the full data set of reality, not just the bare minimum required for biological persistence.
Which gives us an incredibly sharp diagnostic tool for analyzing modern societies.
It really does.
I mean, think about human beings today who are trapped in pure survival mode. The person working 3-gig economy jobs, entirely consumed by the anxiety of the next paycheck, the next meal, the next rent payment.
Yeah, the modern grind.
The economic system has effectively reduced them to the perceptual state of the donkey.
That's a brutal way to put it, but it's accurate.
They are entirely blind to the larger system because their bandwidth is entirely consumed by utility. There's no room for Zaka Jamaliyat.
And historically, we see this play out at the macro level, too. Nations in decline, societies that are basically dying, inevitably banish aesthetic joy.
Wait, really?
Like
Like as a rule?
almost always. They tear down complex architecture and replace it with brutalist concrete blocks. They slash funding for arts and humanities in favor of purely functional vocational training. They reduce the human experience to rigid utility.
Wow.
And the text argues that this suppression of beauty is not merely unfortunate, it is a primary symptom of civilizational death. It's a regression back to the animal state.
So a civilization that stops appreciating, the silence of the dawn or the specific visual of livestock returning at dusk, which the text mentions, has basically lost half of its sensory input.
Yes, they are misreading the system.
Okay, so if the individual organism survives through utility and achieves human consciousness through aesthetics, the individual still has a massive mechanical flaw.
Oh, which...
We run out of energy.
Yes, we do.
Which means we need a daily maintenance protocol. And this leads us to the linguistic deep dive into verse 23, where the text frames sleep as a sign.
Right. And of his signs is your sleep by night and by day. Now, the traditional approach is to read this and just say, oh, sleep is a miracle. God makes us sleep. We wake up by magic. It becomes this mystical state.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because treating sleep as magic completely ignores the mechanical reality of the human machine.
Absolutely.
I mean, isn't sleep fundamentally a biological vulnerability? From an evolutionary perspective, the apex predator shouldn't need to paralyze itself for 8 hours a day, leaving itself open to attack.
You're viewing vulnerability purely from the perspective of external predation, but you have to view it thermodynamically.
Thermodynamically. Okay, break that down.
Any mechanical system, no matter how advanced, requires energy recruitment. The human cognitive and physical engine expends a staggering amount of energy during conscious operation.
Right, our brains use a ton of calories.
A massive percentage of your daily caloric intake. You cannot have continuous high-level output without input and thermal regulation.
Okay, think of a high-end computer server farm.
Perfect analogy.
If you run complex processes on those servers constantly, they heat up. The physical architecture degrades. The cache fills up with junk data. If you bypass the thermal throttling, the processor will literally melt itself to slag.
Exactly. The system must have a built-in mechanism to cool down, clear its cache, and reallocate resources.
And that is exactly what sleep is.
Yes. It is an embedded, non-negotiable maintenance protocol. During sleep, the brain is actively clearing out amyloid beta and other metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours.
It's defragmenting the hard drive.
Consolidating memory data, repairing cellular damage. The text points to this biological power-down sequence not as a magic trick, but as an observable, running proof of system design.
It's a mechanism ensuring the machine doesn't burn out.
Yes. And again, look at how modern society treats this mechanism.
Oh, we view sleep as an annoyance.
A weakness.
We have an entire hustle culture dedicated to biohacking our way out of our own biology. We consume massive amounts of stimulants, bragging about only needing 4 hours of sleep so we can maximize productivity.
We treat our own bodies like infinite resource extraction sites.
Yeah, and the system punishes that misalignment with extreme prejudice.
It really does.
Right.
When you fight the foundational maintenance schedule, the machine fails. You see catastrophic spikes in cardiovascular disease, cognitive impairment, psychological collapse.
The text is basically telling you the requirement for rest is a law of nature. You can either align your socio-economic structures with it, or you can be broken by it.
That's the law of requital in action right there.
Okay, so the system maintains the individual biological unit through the daily reset of sleep. The individual organism is sustained, but an individual only lasts, 80, maybe 100 years?
If they're lucky.
Right. If the system is so perfectly designed, how does it solve the entropy of death? Because the organism dies, and the specific data it accumulated dies with it.
Right. It needs continuity.
The system has to have a mechanism to transmit this biological and aesthetic data to the next generation without the whole process collapsing into chaos.
And this is perhaps the most profound and, frankly, radically unsentimental reframing in the entire analysis. We are zooming out from the maintenance of the individual to the maintenance of the species.
Which brings us to verse 21.
Yes. This verse discusses the relationship between spouses, specifically using the phrase mawaddah wa rahma, which is universally translated as love and mercy.
And the immediate reaction of almost everyone who reads that is purely emotional.
Oh, of course.
We think of poetry, romantic comedies, the warm feeling of a Hallmark card. Or on the flip side, some traditional societies view marriage as a cold, purely utilitarian breeding program.
Just a cure for individual loneliness or a way to have heirs.
Right.
Well, the framework Parges provides violently rejects both the romantic sentimentality and the utilitarian breeding program. It demands we look at the actual Arabic word used to define the partners, which is zawj.
Zawj. Now, that's usually just translated as spouse, right?
It is, but linguistically, it is a highly specific structural term. It does not just mean any partner. It means two components that are completely equally necessary for a machine to move.
Okay, so going back to analogies. Think of a heavy cart with two wheels.
Yes.
Those wheels are zawj. For the cart to function, those wheels must be perfectly matched. What happens if one wheel is a massive, heavy tractor tire and the other is a tiny, fragile bicycle tire?
The structural imbalance destroys the machine.
Right.
The cart doesn't just move poorly. The axle snaps under the uneven load. It goes in circles. It cannot traverse difficult terrain.
Or what if one wheel is perfectly round, but the other wheel is a square?
Absolute chaos. The concept of zawj requires absolute structural equality, homogeneity, and intellectual alignment.
Wait, intellectual alignment too?
Yes. If the two components in the human pair bond are not a matched set, if there's a massive power imbalance, if one is treated as property and the other as owner, or if there's an unbridgeable intellectual chasm between them.
The civilizational cart crashes at the household level. But calling marriage a structural component for a civilizational cart sounds incredibly clinical. Doesn't that strip the humanity out of it?
I'd argue it actually elevates it, because it removes the fragility of romance and replaces it with the durability of a vital function.
How so?
Well, why does the system specifically require mawaddah wa rahma, love and mercy, rather than just instinct or duty?
I guess because raising kids is hard.
It's the most resource-intensive biological process on the planet.
Yeah.
A newborn goat can walk and forage within hours of birth. A human infant is entirely helpless for years.
Yeah, they need a solid 15 to 20 years of constant, massive investment. Physical resources, time, and complex cultural data transmission.
Exactly. Pure biological instinct wears off after the infant stage. Duty alone breeds deep resentment over 20 years.
That's very true.
So the love and mercy installed between spouses is not a luxury emotion. It is highly specific psychological glue.
Psychological glue.
It's an emotional buffer, engineered specifically to absorb the immense friction of two distinct egos operating in close proximity under extreme stress for 2 decades.
Wow. So without that precise emotional buffer, the pair bond shatters under the stress of resource scarcity or just interpersonal conflict.
It shatters, and when the pair bond shatters, the cultural data fails to transfer to the child properly.
Right, you just get the biological propagation of the species, basically a breeding program, but you don't get the transmission of the aesthetic layer, the complex language, the civilizational memory.
The pair bond is the fundamental micro-unit of civilization. The text is stating, as a matter of systemic law, that gender equality and deep structural psychological harmony are not modern liberal inventions.
Right, they are just new political trends.
No, they are absolute prerequisites for civilizational survival, encoded in the base manual of reality. If the wheels are unmatched at the household level, the empire inevitably falls because the next generation receives corrupted data.
Okay, so the pair bond handles the local data transfer from one generation to the next. But if the system relies entirely on local transfers, it risks stagnation.
How do you mean?
Well, if every cart is identical and driving on the exact same road, how does the system test new environments? How does it innovate?
I see.
The system needs a way to run parallel experiments globally to figure out what actually works in different conditions.
Which logically drives us to verse 22. This is the engine of reason and the civilizational data set.
Right, the diversity verse.
Exactly. The text states that the diversity of your languages and your colors is a sign for those who know.
And there's that phrase again, a sign.
A sign, an observable data point. Not a call for progressive tolerance or a mere observation of geography, but a critical piece of the survival mechanism.
Okay, so why is diversity a survival mechanism?
To understand this, Parges references the work of Dr. Richard Maurice Buck and his concept of cosmic consciousness.
Cosmic consciousness, right.
The core question is, how do we empirically map the evolutionary stage of a civilization. We don't measure it merely by their monuments or the sharpness of their weapons,
What do we measure by?
by the breadth of their language and the precision of their perception. Specifically, how many distinct concepts do they possess, and how accurately do they categorize physical reality?
Like colors.
Like colors.
Yeah.
This is where the data gets absolutely fascinating. If you study primitive societies or early human texts, you find highly limited vocabularies for color.
Right, I've read about this.
A society operating at a baseline survival level might only have 1, 2, or 3 words for colors, essentially just light, dark, and maybe red for blood.
Because they literally lacked the perceptual resolution to categorize the world in higher fidelity?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, compare that to the sociological data point the text references regarding the Arabs of that era. Even in a harsh desert environment, they had distinct concepts for at least 6 foundational colors. But much more impressively, they had something on the magnitude of 5,000 distinct words and conceptual frameworks just for a camel.
5,000 words for a camel. That sounds absurd to a modern listener.
It does, but think about what that actually represents.
It's like how modern coders have hundreds of ways to categorize data structures.
Yes, or how Inuit languages are famously said to have multiple categorizations for snow.
Right, so you have a word for a camel that is thirsty but can walk another day.
A word for a camel traversing loose sand versus hard rock.
A word for a pregnant camel exhibiting specific behavioral cues.
Exactly. That isn't just a bloated vocabulary. That is extremely high-resolution data capture of a critical survival asset.
Wow, okay, I see that.
And this leads to Parwez's central insight regarding this verse. What's fascinating here is that the diversity of human languages and the diversity of human colors, which represents physiological adaptation to different environments, is not an accident.
It isn't just random noise in the biological system.
No, the diversity is the signal set.
But wouldn't a unified global language and a single unified culture reduce friction? I mean, wouldn't it make civilization vastly more efficient if we all just operated on the exact same software?
It might be efficient in the short term, but it would be catastrophic in the long term.
Why?
Because in systems theory, homogenization is the enemy of information.
Homogenization is the enemy of information.
Yes. If every human on Earth spoke the exact same language, lived in the exact same environment, and utilized the exact same conceptual frameworks, the system would entirely stagnate.
It would have no reserve capacity to adapt to new, unforeseen challenges.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because language dictates how you solve problems. If your language lacks the conceptual resolution to describe a new pathogen or a subtle shift in the climate, you cannot formulate a defense against it.
You literally can't think your way out of the problem.
Right. So the law of nature uses variety to generate options. Every distinct sociolinguistic group, every culture with its own unique language and environmental perspective is a vital data point in a grand global experiment.
The system is stress testing, which social configurations and linguistic frameworks actually produce the most resilient results.
Exactly. So when an empire, whether it's an ancient conqueror or a modern, globalized monoculture, tries to force everyone to speak one language, adopt one economic system, and assimilate into a single way of thinking.
They aren't just being politically oppressive.
Wow.
Systemically speaking, they are actively destroying the civilizational data set. They are blinding the species by reducing our collective perceptual resolution.
The verse is speaking directly to anthropologists and data scientists. Do not erase the variety, because the variety is the mechanism of human evolution.
Man, that is powerful. But this raises the ultimate operational question.
Yes.
If the system is constantly generating all this diversity, running thousands of parallel cultural experiments, what is the feedback loop?
Right.
How does the system tell us which of these diverse options are objectively good and which are catastrophic? Because not all cultures survive, not all paradigms work. How do we calibrate?
And this brings us to the law of requital, mukafat elam, which is perfectly encapsulated in verse 24.
Okay, verse 24.
The text uses a powerful ancient metaphor. He shows you lightning as fear and hope.
Lightning as fear and hope.
Now, we must radically separate this from the traditional theological reading.
Because usually, across almost all ancient human cultures, lightning is interpreted emotionally and supernaturally.
Right. It's Zeus throwing a thunderbolt.
Yeah.
It's divine wrath meant to strike fear into the hearts of sinners.
Or, when it brings rain, it is divine grace, a magical gift from the heavens to reward the pious.
Exactly. But Parwez's analytical framework firmly rejects that. In a systems context, fear and hope are not emotional states.
They don't represent a psychological reaction to a moody deity in the clouds.
No, they represent something much more precise.
Okay.
Correct risk calibration.
Correct risk calibration. Okay, give me an example.
To understand risk calibration, let's look at a concrete example. Compare an ancient, superstitious farmer with a modern, scientifically literate meteorologist. When the storm rolls in, the superstitious farmer sees the lightning, falls to his knees in terror, and prays that the gods don't burn his house down.
He is completely paralyzed by his emotional reaction to the phenomenon.
Exactly. He takes no physical precautions because he believes the outcome is entirely dependent on supernatural whimsy.
But the meteorologist reads the lightning not as a mood, but as a mechanism.
Yes.
They read it as a specific data point in the electrical hydrological cycle. The lightning is pure, raw energy. Yes, it possesses objective physical risk. It can ignite fires. It can destroy structures. That is the rational fear.
Right.
But it is also the precursor to the rain that powers agriculture, fixes nitrogen in the soil, and cools the biosphere. That is the rational, objective hope.
The productive law of the universe, the law of requital, actively rewards the accurate reading of these physical signals.
So the society that reads the lightning correctly?
They harness the rain through advanced irrigation. They predict the storm patterns. They invent the lightning rod to ground the electrical charge and protect their infrastructure.
They manage the risk, and therefore they reap the reward. They thrive.
Exactly. But the emotional reaction is hardwired into us. I mean, you can't just reason away the visceral terror of a lightning strike hitting 100 feet from you.
No, it's terrifying.
But the text isn't asking you to stop being physically startled. It's asking you to accurately calibrate what you are afraid of and how you respond.
And it brutally punishes misreading.
Oh, without hesitation. The society that ignores the physical reality of the lightning, that attributes it to ghosts or demons, fails to build robust shelter.
They fail to manage their crop cycles.
And consequently, they get struck. They starve. Their ignorance is punished by the system itself.
Fear and hope is a mandate for scientific literacy. It is the system telling humanity, understand my mechanics or be destroyed by them.
That's it right there.
And think about how relevant this is to the listener right now. Look at how we treat macro events in our modern world, like global economic recessions or massive climate events.
Oh, totally.
Do we read them as just bad luck? Do we act like the ancient farmer blaming Zeus, crying about how unfair the market is?
Usually, yes.
Or do we read them as predictable feedback loops in a complex system that we fail to accurately manage?
That is a staggering paradigm shift. It takes what was previously categorized as religion and turns it into applied physics and macroeconomics.
The universe does not care if you are crying or praying when the lightning strikes.
No, it only cares if you understand electrical grounding.
The feedback loop is physical reality. Actions have inescapable systemic consequences.
And this constant unforgiving cycle of risk, reward, and natural law leads us to the ultimate philosophy that governs not just individual storms or individual marriages, but the entire macro cycle of nations and eras.
Which brings us to the final major theme of our analysis, the philosophy of change.
Yes, the source material introduces the concept of Taghayyur, which translates to continuous, unending change.
Taghayyur.
The fundamental argument here is that without change, without friction and movement, existence is essentially dead.
To illustrate this, the framework points to a very vivid physical phenomenon observed in the text. Dead, dry, cracked land being revived by the sudden introduction of rain.
Right.
It uses this observable physical reality to explain the sociological reality of how dead nations can be revived.
And the text brings in the philosophical poetry of Muhammad Iqbal to really hammer this point home.
Oh, Iqbal. What did he say?
Well, Iqbal famously argued against the traditional concept of a static paradise.
Yeah.
He posited that a heaven without change, a reality where everything is perfectly static, where there is no pain, no shifting landscape, no challenge to overcome,
Is indistinguishable from a graveyard.
Exactly. It is a night of endless non-existence. The absolute proof of life is movement. It is Taghayyur.
So if we map that concept back onto the macro cycle of nations, the text is revealing that civilizations are subject to the exact same diurnal cycles as the planet we discussed at the very beginning.
They rise and fall.
Nations rise, they have their dawn, their morning of vitality, of intellectual curiosity, of aesthetic appreciation, and matched pair bonds.
And nations fall. They reach their dusk, their night of rigidity, dogma, and decay.
And this rise and fall is not dictated by arbitrary divine favor.
No, it is dictated entirely by a nation's alignment with this law of change. When a nation becomes rigid, when it refuses to adapt its language to new data, when it suppresses the diversity of its people into a monoculture,
When it banishes the arts.
when it misreads the lightning and fails to calibrate its risk,
Mhm.
it enters its night. It becomes the dead, dry earth.
But the system is not inherently pessimistic.
No, not at all.
There is a profound systemic hope built into the mechanics. Just as the physical rain revives a dormant, seemingly dead seed buried deep in the desert sand, a culturally dead society can be revived.
But how is it revived? Not by magic.
Right, not by returning to the exact same rituals that failed them in the first place.
It is revived by realigning itself with the productive laws of the universe.
If a dying society updates its data set.
If it restores the structural equality of the Zauj in its households,
If it recalibrates its risk management to understand the modern lightning.
it triggers a new dawn. The laws of civilizational revival are as mechanical, as predictable, and as reliable as the laws of the water cycle.
Wow. So we have spent the last hour basically pulling apart the mechanics of reality.
It's been a journey.
From the planetary schedule of the Earth's rotation to the evolutionary necessity of perceiving the beauty of a rose, from the thermodynamic requirement of sleep to the structural load-bearing capacity of a marriage.
From the high-resolution data capture of diverse languages to the meteorological risk calibration of a thunderstorm.
After unpacking all of this, what is the ultimate synthesis? What is the permanent principle the listener needs to walk away with?
The synthesis is that the natural order, I as the argument.
It is the argument.
The natural order is not a secondary supplement to a religious text. It is the primary text.
Right.
The verses we've analyzed 17 through 24 are merely pointers. They are directing human consciousness to look outward at the machinery of reality. Sleep, rain, love, language, diversity. These are not localized miracles or random biological accidents.
They are observable, running proofs that the system has a highly intentional design.
And that this design demands human alignment. What changes throughout history is simply the fashionable explanation for these signs.
Right, because ancient civilizations looked at the rain and the lightning and said, it's the gods.
And modern secular civilizations look at the exact same phenomena and say it's purely random mutation or it's blind market forces.
The fashionable explanations shift with the eras.
But the correct reading, the profound realization that these phenomena demonstrate a constant, alignable law of cause and effect, never changes.
Which means verses 17 through 24 of Surah Ar-Rum are not a list of spooky miracles for you to blindly revere on a Friday afternoon.
No, they are the universe presented to you as an open book exam.
The manual for human survival is written in the rotation of the earth, the chemistry of a flower, and the thermodynamic rest of your own brain.
The manual is open. The data is available. The only question that remains is whether your civilization has the perceptual resolution to read it and the courage to align with it.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. To you, the listener, thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense, uncompromising deep dive into the systems engineering of reality.
It's been fantastic.
But we cannot let you go without bringing this massive civilizational theory down to the micro level of your own life.
Right, we have to apply it.
We've spent an hour talking about how ancient and modern empires misread the signs of the system. But what about you?
Think about your own life.
If the universe really is an open book exam and nature cycles your sleep debt, the structural equality of your relationships, the economic and social storms brewing overhead are the syllabus. What crucial signal in your own daily ecosystem are you currently misreading as noise?